So today we're just going to spend about 15 minutes on what constitutional principles in action really means. So the lesson will cover that, and then we'll have some time for questions. I did add that video segment in that question and answer segment just because I wasn't sure if we would need that full 15 minutes for questions. And then we will briefly go over the activity that is associated with this lesson, and then we'll have some time for wrap-up questions at the end as well. So the main learning objectives for this lesson would be to examine the fundamental constitutional principles and values that are life, liberty, equality, and talk about what do those mean, those fundamental ideas. Then we're going to look and analyze past and present ideas based on constitutional principles and how Americans look to narrow the gap between what are the constitutional ideas that we have and what is the reality that we actually see in our everyday life. And then we want to also gain a better understanding of how to successfully complete activity 241. So we have noticed that there have been some students in the past that have struggled with getting full credit on this assignment. So we want to make sure that we are covering that and that you feel comfortable when asked to answer this assignment for this class. All right, so starting out, what do we mean when we talk about life, liberty, and equality? So these are some really pretty amorphous or very big ideas. They sound great, but when we're talking about life, we can break that down into maybe more smaller bits, I guess you would say, that are things that we talk about in our everyday life. So for example, would that tie into things like pro-choice or abortion kind of questions? Does life have to do with the healthcare debate that we see in our society? It's a very hot topic right now. What do we mean by liberty? So freedom, what does that mean? How does that relate to the laws that we see in our country? And so in some states, we might see that laws are very different than in other states. How does that impact people across the board? We just saw, for example, there were some laws passed recently that gave some broader ideas about marijuana use in the United States. Some states are really still strict on that. Some states, they have medical, some states they have recreational. How does that play into this idea of liberty? And if you break a law, what is the kind of justice that goes with that? And equality, how do we judge what is equal? Do we see equality across the board in education, for example? Does everyone have the same access to educational opportunities? Do people have the same access to, again, healthcare or some things like that? So these are really big questions that we want to try and break down into smaller pieces and look at really kind of from an everyday point of view. So we know that unfortunately, we talk about rights, freedom, equality, justice a lot in our society, again, especially around election time and things like that. We also see very much a struggle between our freedoms, what we consider our personal rights, and the common good or equality. So we'll talk a little bit about those in two historical documents that your lesson brings forward. One is Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and the others would be the Equal Rights Amendment. So both of these back from kind of the 1960s, when there was a lot of civil unrest because there was not a great feeling about everybody getting the same freedoms, and that there wasn't a lot of equality in the United States at that time. So looking at an excerpt from Dr. King's letter, and this is just a small portion that you would read in your activity, but I didn't want to have too much information on here. But he does write here towards the end of his letter, that he wants to say, my friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without legal and nonviolent pressure. So basically saying that you have to protest in order to get some of these civil rights, especially at this time. History is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily, because a lot of people don't want to give up the king of the hill status if they don't have to. So he continues on by saying individuals, so individual people, may see the moral light and give up their unjust posture, meaning that individual people might say, yeah, I'm privileged and I don't want to do that because I feel that that's not necessarily moral to be above someone else. But as Reinhold Niebuhr, which was another person that King worked with, he reminded us that groups are more immoral than individuals, meaning that usually when you get a group of people together, they might lose some of their ideas of what's right and wrong because you get that kind of group think and group action. So can you think of any recent examples in our society that might relate to this excerpt from Dr. King's letter? So you want to think on that for just a little bit. And then also your activity is going to ask you to look at the Equal Rights Amendment. So this was passed by Congress, and it was ratified by the different states, meaning that the different states in the Union all accepted this as federal law. And it had three basic sections. The main one being that people could not be discriminated against based on their sex. So equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged, meaning shrunken down, by the United States or by any specific state on account of sex. The Congress should have the power to enforce with legislation the provisions of this article. And then it goes on to say that amendment was added 2 years past the date that it was ratified. So they had 2 years to kind of get it up and running and put into place. So the Equal Rights Amendment, was very big on, at that time, women's rights, but we see it being used a lot in today's society when we're talking about LGBTQ conversations, and how does the Equal Rights Amendment play into things like gay marriage or things like that have become more of a flashpoint in our society today than maybe it was back in the 60s. And so they're using the Equal Rights Amendment to really talk about some of that. Do people who have a different sexual orientation fall under this Equal Rights Amendment? And there's a lot of debate back and forth of how to make that work. So just basically trying to see, is everyone feeling equal and having that same opportunity for life, liberty, equality within our society as a whole. So those are those constitutional principles. All right, do you have any specific questions about the lesson? I know that sometimes these are pretty big concepts, but I think that they do relate pretty well to our current situation as well. And if not questions about the specific lesson, you can always bring up anything about the specific class. So if you had a question about US government in general or anything else, you can ask that now or at the end. So what I would like to do now is go ahead, since we haven't had any questions yet, I'd like to share my screen and show a video. It's from the Crash Course series, which I really like this. It doesn't fit exactly with this lesson, but it does talk about the constitutional principles. It's about 6 minutes long. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, do a new share. And hopefully I can, hold on just a second. Let's see. Okay.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're finally, at long last, moving on from the structures and branches of government and onto the structures and branches of trees. This is a nature show now. Okay, we're not moving on completely because we're still talking about courts, but today we'll be discussing actual court decisions and the kinds of things that courts rule on rather than how they do it. That's right, we're moving on to civil rights and civil liberties. Okay, first I want to talk about something that I find confusing, the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. Usually in America we use the terms interchangeably, which adds to the confusion, but lawyers and political scientists draw a distinction, so you should know about it. Then you can go back to calling civil liberties rights and civil rights liberties, and most people won't care. But I'll care. I'll be disappointed in you. So civil liberties are limitations placed on the government. Basically, there are things the government can't do that might interfere with your personal freedom. Civil rights are curbs on the power of majorities to make decisions that would benefit some at the expense of others. Basically, civil rights are guarantees of equal citizenship, and they mean that citizens are protected from discrimination by majorities. Take, for example, same-sex marriage. You could think of it as a liberty, except that not everyone is free to marry at any given time. 6-year-olds can't get married, and you can't marry your sibling. But same-sex marriage is a civil rights issue because in the states that don't allow it, the majority of voters is denying something to a minority, creating inequality in the way that the laws work. Now, just to make things more confusing, lawyers often talk about the difference between substantive and procedural liberties, but they usually call them rights instead of liberties. It's a lawyer eagle. A legal eagle. Substantive liberties are limits on what the government can do. For example, the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law establishing religion. So this means that they cannot create a national church or declare that Christianity or Islam or Hinduism is the official religion of the U.S. Procedural liberties are limits on how the government can act. For example, in America, in courtroom dramas, there's a presumption that someone is innocent until proven guilty. This presumption means that in criminal cases, juries and judges have to act as though the accused is innocent until the prosecution convinces them otherwise. If they are not convinced, the accused person doesn't go to prison. So now that we understand the difference between civil rights and civil liberties perfectly because of my amazing explanation, let's focus on the liberties and try to figure out what they are and where they come from, with some help from Thought Bubble. So civil liberties are contained in the incredibly unhelpfully named Bill of Rights, which isn't even called that in the Constitution. It's just the name we give to the first 10 amendments. The 9th Amendment is included to remind us that the list of liberties and or rights in the other amendments isn't exhaustive. There might be other rights out there, but the Constitution doesn't specifically say what they are. Thanks, Constitution. In some cases, it's pretty clear. The First Amendment, for example, says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or abridging the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or to assemble or to infringe the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Pretty straightforward. But other cases are not so clear. The Second Amendment says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but it doesn't say by whom. Same thing with the Fifth Amendment guarantees against self-incrimination. Could Congress force you to incriminate yourself? How would they do that? And the Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishments, like presumably shock pens. But it doesn't say who is forbidden from cruelly and unusually punishing. My mom wasn't forbidden from keeping me from playing video games. As usual, we might expect the Supreme Court to sort out this mess, but initially they were no help at all. In a case you probably never heard of called Barron versus Baltimore, decided in 1833, the court said that the Bill of Rights applied to the national, meaning federal government, not to the states. They said that every American has dual citizenship, but not the good kind. They meant that you are a citizen of the U.S. and of the state in which you reside, and basically that the Constitution only protected you from the federal government. In other words, if the state of Indiana wanted to punish me cruelly or unusually, they could. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Barron versus Baltimore left Americans in a bit of a civil liberties pickle. And not the good kind of pickle. They were protected from the national government doing terrible things like quartering troops in their homes, but not from the state doing the same thing. And since the state was close to home and the national government was far away and compared with today, tiny and weak, these protections were pretty weak sauce. So what happened to change this? I hope something, because I like a zesty government sauce. The 14th Amendment and the Supreme Court happened. After the Civil War, as part of Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution. Of these, the 14th is the most important, probably the most important of all amendments. What does it say? Well, the first section, which is the one that really matters, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, okay? It reads, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. What this means is that the federal government's like, listen, states, you can't be dumb. Just stop it. Okay, we're all in this together, all right? It means states can't deny equal protection, civil rights, or due process, which in this case encompasses civil liberties. This, in theory, makes it impossible for states to infringe upon the liberties in the Bill of Rights. But the legal system being what it is, it's not quite that simple. Did you think it'd be simple? The Supreme Court could have just ruled that all the rights and liberties in the Bill of Rights apply to the states, which seems to be what the 14th Amendment implies, but they didn't. Instead, they ruled that each of the rights or liberties had to be incorporated against the states on a case-by-case basis. This is a concept called selective incorporation, and it supposedly reserves more power to the states. What it really means is that when people felt that the states were violating their liberties, they had to go to the Supreme Court, which by now has incorporated almost every clause in the Bill of Rights against the states. You want examples? We got them. In the famous case of Gitlow versus New York, the court ruled that the First Amendment protection of freedom of speech could not be violated by a state. In this case, it was New York, but once a liberty is incorporated against one state, it's incorporated against all of them. In Mapp versus Ohio, the court ruled that states couldn't use evidence gathered from warrantless searches. In Benton versus Maryland, the right against double jeopardy, being tried for the same crime twice, was incorporated against the states. By now, almost all the rights and liberties mentioned in the first 10 amendments have been incorporated against the states. This means that individuals are protected from all their governments taking away their liberties, and that's a good thing. I love my liberties. So we'll be talking about civil rights and civil liberties for a number of episodes, and this topic, while confusing, can be lots of fun. We might play liberties bingo or civil rights kickball. I don't know what those things are, but they sound like fun. The main thing to remember is that going all the way back to the framers, Americans have been concerned about a too powerful government taking away citizens' freedoms. Yes, these liberties apply mostly to citizens, although some do apply to non-citizens too. In order to put limits on government, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution in 1789. But this didn't mean that those limits applied to the states, probably because the founders expected states to be the main protectors of rights. And in fact, many state constitutions have provisions that copy or in some ways go beyond what's in the U.S. Constitution. Only after the 14th Amendment was passed following the Civil War did the national government get around to addressing this issue of states denying people's liberties. Even then, it took numerous court cases for us to get to the point that most of the liberties that we assume cannot be taken away by the government have actually been guaranteed through the process of selective incorporation. It's taken a long time to get where we are, and there's still a long way to go. Protecting civil liberties requires vigilant citizens to be aware of the ways their government is overstepping its bounds. But that's only half the equation. It's also vital that our majority pay attention to the civil rights of others, and that we ensure that everyone is afforded the same protections and benefits promised by our system of law. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with PBS Digital Studios. Support for Crash Course US.
Okay. Okay, guys. So like I said, that didn't go exactly along with what we were talking about, but I did want to bring that up because it talks about that idea of civil liberties and how those are enshrined in the Constitution, but that we see that the other parts of the government are also involved. So the Supreme Court was mentioned there, also the idea of states versus federal laws. So anybody have any questions about the video before we move on to talk about the activity? Okay, so then let's go ahead and look at what your activity is for this unit, or this lesson, I'm sorry. So there's a three-part question, or three questions that go along with this activity. The first being, what are some of the constitutional principles and values promoted by Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail and the Equal Rights Amendment? So you're going to want to look in your lesson. You'll have a more detailed excerpt of the of both of these things. So you'll see Dr. King's letter. I gave you just one paragraph of that, And the Equal Rights Amendment, there will be a little bit more detail in that as well. But I did point out those 3 main points of that amendment. So you want to make sure that you answer both portions of that question, okay? And you want to use 3 sentences there for that answer, okay? The second question that you're going to be asked is, why do you think Americans value the ideas of liberty, equality, and justice? So what do you think it is about American ideas that, why do you think we value those things? And why do you think they disagree when it comes to more specific rights? So for example, why do you think that we get in an argument over healthcare in the United States when most of us would probably agree that the idea of life, you know, the right to life and liberty and equality and justice and all of those things are important parts of the American society. So where do we find that line between what do we consider with life? Again, that can go with the healthcare issue. It could be tied in with pro-life versus pro-choice conversations. So you can kind of use your own discretion there when you want to talk about that. And then finally, the third question is you want to think about the ERA specifically, so the Equal Rights Amendment, all right? What constitutional principles and values are in question by those who opposed those amendments? So why did some people go against the Equal Rights Amendment, and why were there people who were for it? Okay, so you want to make sure that you're writing 3 separate questions here.
Did you hear me?
Okay.
She can hear.
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm glad to see you guys here. So here is the rubric for this specific lesson, okay? And this is on your lesson sheet as well. I just wanted to cut and paste it here so that you could see it. So each question has its own expectation. So question 1, you'd have 3 or more complete sentences, and you want to have 2 facts from the lesson and 2 personal opinions in order to get full credit for that, okay? So the same thing goes for full credit for question 2. You want to have 3 or more sentences. You want to make sure that you reference something from King's Letter and from the Equal Rights Amendment, okay? And you want to put in a personal piece. Remember that this is a lesson that's really going to ask you to kind of dig into how you feel, not only, you know, what the constitutional principles are, but how you feel about them, okay? And then finally, the question on the ERA, you want to again have 3 sentences, and you want to talk in at least 1 sentence about what do you think people were thinking, the people who opposed that, and then what about people who supported it, and then your personal. So I would say 1 sentence each. You know, people who opposed equal rights, why do you think people would not want to have, you know, equal rights under the law? And who might those people be? I would guess that those are probably people who are benefiting from non-equal rights, correct? And then the people who supported it, why do you think that they felt that way? And then what is your personal opinion about that? Would you have voted for this or not? So again, with this, I think the challenge that students are having in getting full credit is that they're not answering all 3 of the questions separately. They're kind of just answering in one big general answer, and it's not hitting the rubric correctly. So you should have a total of at least 9 sentences for this assignment. So just go ahead and break it down into question 1, 2, and 3. Give at least 3 sentences, and you should be good to go to get full credit on this assignment. Okay, so do you have any specific questions about the activity?
No.
Okay. Any questions about anything else in class or social studies or anything like that? that you can think of that you want to touch base on. Okay. All right. Well, this video will be up. So if you wanted to go back and review, you will have the opportunity to do that. It probably will be posted, I would say, by tomorrow or over the weekend. And if you do want to reach out and contact me directly, there is my phone number. You can either call or text me, and my email address is there as well. I'm typically in between 10 and 2. That would be the best time to call me. So if you're wanting to talk on the phone, and you can also always send me a chat within the Buzz system, so I can look there and catch up with you as well. So thank you guys so much for being here, and I look forward to looking at your activities when you get them in.